Hello everyone. Tonight we're going to start with the Ottoman Harem concubine's life, the world behind the veil. The truth, which was frequently relegated to rumors or fiction, was much more complex and consisted of politics, beauty, power and fierce rivalry, all of which were contained behind the imperial palace's gilded walls. Please take a moment to like and subscribe to the video before you settle in, but only if you truly like what I do here. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from around the globe, so please let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Let's ease into tonight's voyage together by turning down the lights and possibly turning on a fan to provide a gentle background hum. The good news is that you just woke up in the harem of Topkapi Palace. All around you are satin, silk, and fragrant rosewater. The bad news? There are 200 other concubines around you, and they may or may not desire to outshine, outscheming, or even outliving you. You wake up on a padded divan that appears to have been hand-stitched with golden thread by blind angels, which it most likely was. This should feel opulent, right? It doesn't. It has the consistency of silky pressure. A bell rings for grooming, not for prayer. You have just 10 minutes to get your face ready to appear immaculate by Ottoman style, which is to paint it like an oil painting from the Renaissance and smile as though you're enjoying it. There is enough kohl eyeliner to paint a love message across your eyelids, crushed pearls for your cheeks and rose oil for your skin. Mascara, created out of disappointment and used to twig. Privacy? Never heard of her. You share your chamber with women who may love you like sisters or plot your downfall like middle management villains. Compared to letters, gossip spreads more quickly. Over pomegranate seeds, alliances are formed. A hairpin left in the wrong spot is the first sign of betrayal. What about the smell? Imagine a fog bank fragrant with jasmine, laced with incense, anxiousness, and the unending desire to attract the Sultan's attention. This would be the perfume that Chanel would produce if ambition and claustrophobia were ever released. After being hand-washed by a 12-year-old servant girl who strangely already despises you, you get up and make your way to the morning roll call when senior eunuchs choose which concubines are called to the Sultan's notice. It resembles a pageant for beauty, but existential fear is the winner. No, you are unable to go. Yes, there is always someone observing, and you must continue to be intriguing, aromatic, and productive if you want to survive. Greetings from the Ottoman royal harem, where your bed is softer than freedom, your smile is strategy, and your first breath is a power play. From here, it only becomes more bizarre. Greetings from the steamy bath known as the hammam, where imperial politics take place while nude. Technically, it would be correct to think that the bathhouse is for hygienic purposes. However, alliances are also formed here in the harem. Your pause, rivalries, and the subtle sense of lavender, lemons, and passive anger permeate everything. Clad in silk towels with embroidery, the concubines enter like elegant ghosts. You follow suit, acting as though this isn't the most frightening nudity you've ever encountered. Like deadly territorial swans with nicer skin than you will ever have, the senior women glide through the marble chamber. The attendants wash you down with what appears to be love, but is really a loofah dripping with retaliation. As you are exfoliated within an inch of your former life, your skin tingles, your dignity wanes, and you attempt to avoid making eye contact. The bath is more than just a bath, and you pick it up quickly. It's actually a covert surveillance chamber. Everyone is quietly, but not overtly, watching. Who is seated next to whom? Who is whispering? Is anyone finding the Valide Sultan's niece's joke a bit too funny? You're new, therefore you don't talk much. Speaking on the board too soon. The veterans will either choose to overlook you or subtly determine that you need to be corrected, usually by reassigning your chores or banishing you from society. That being said, the harem's soft power is initially shown to you at the hammam. There are always half-spoken stories of ladies who rose not only because they attracted the Sultan's attention, but also because they knew the perfect older concubine, the right bath attendant, and the right narrative to tell at the proper sultry time. Additionally, it's the one spot in the palace where secrets unintentionally leak out, typically amid perfumed soaps and water splashes. You discover which concubines are preferred, which haven't been called upon in months, and which eunuch is said to have left a romantic message. Outrageous! You heard all of this while someone was rubbing your elbows as if they were upset with you. You're polished, pink, and 12% more paranoid when you leave the hammam than when you walked in. Congratulations, you have glowing skin. Your thoughts, heat, jasmine, and the politics of proximity have left it perpetually foggy. Adorable if you thought the harem was just silk pillows and distant flute music. Actually, you've discovered by now, however, that it's more like a slow-motion chess game with gorgeous board and dangerously knowledgeable pieces than a day spa. The eunuchs are another group, in particular the castrated high-ranking guards known as the black eunuchs who answer directly to the legitimate sultan. They have authority over who enters and exits the harem, who is called upon, who is disregarded, and sometimes who vanishes completely and is never heard from again. They hardly ever grin. They are not required to. Their very appearance is a gesture that can ruin a career. You pick things up fast. You don't flatter the sultan if you want to live, or even better, prosper. The eunuchs become your friends. Don't give gifts. That raises suspicion. Not with flirtation, which is extremely rude and embarrassing. No. Being courteous, dependable, and most importantly, non-offensively helpful is the key. Nothing is what you're asking for. When called upon, you're always prepared. Since rumors spread more quickly in this palace than the plague, and you don't want your name to be linked to a sentence that ends in, you never, ever chat about them. After that, she was moved to the washroom. Relationships among the concubines are complex in the meantime. One hesitant friend you've made is a Circassian female who acts as though she enjoys needlework but is actually planning something brutal and long-term. You don't know why, but you have an adversary as well. She spent too much time staring at you throughout lute practice. You blinked. You haven't heard from her since. Smiles are loaded, compliments are weapons, and everything is subtle. You begin to miss the emotional simplicity of your old village goat, but you learn. You get the ability to read stillness, how to appear ambitious without getting too near to the top, how to express gratitude to a eunuch for giving you a letter as though it were a scroll from God. Most importantly, you discover that being the most attractive or gifted is not necessary to survive here. It's about realizing how power is expressed through silence, looks, even the way a person's name is pronounced one day and not the next. On the surface, your role as a concubine appears straightforward. Look stunning, smile courteously, and move about the castle like a silk-slippered, emotionally accessible ghost. In actuality, however, you are now supposed to become proficient in the oldest imperial art of all, absorbing everything while feigning to absorb nothing. You're a sponge, a fragrant jeweled sponge who embroiders a strange amount of tulips while remembering who gets an extra apricot for breakfast, who glares at whom, and who sits where. Slight variations in the distribution of fruit. In this palace, it's practically a coup. Hours of instruction that smell like political grooming but sound like finishing school have been added to your daily calendar. You learn about Islamic law, Ottoman etiquette, poetry, music, and, if you're lucky, how to stay awake during dance classes. Like a decorative peacock that can quote Rumi without responding, the goal is to be both pleasantly clever and gorgeous without coming across as menacing. In between, however, is where the true schooling takes place. You get to observe who clears the Valide Sultan's tray, and how long it takes. Just before the unpleasant news arrives, you observe which eunuch enters. You commit the absences to memory. You never inquire as to why, you talk less than you listen. In actuality, you only speak when asked to do so by someone 3 levels higher. Even so, it should be succinct and ideally include a remark that is perceptive, modest, and somehow nice to them without coming across as forced. You are silently preserving every encounter in your mental scroll while you sit there with your hands folded neatly over your embroidery, which might or might not be a distorted dove. Opportunities, alliances, slights, and names, especially names. Additionally, you start to comprehend the implicit rating system. Who is given preference, who is put up with, and who could be demoted to kitchen duty after 3 missed meals. Right now, your wall furnishing falls midway between adequate and intriguing newcomer. It's better than it sounds, so don't worry. In actuality, appearing innocuous is one of the riskiest things you can do in the Ottoman harem, and you're getting rather good at it. In the harem, there are 2 types of terror: the anxiety of being seen and the anxiety of being ignored. Today, you are flirting dangerously with the second. It starts out innocently. You're given a new robe, but it's far more striking than the subdued grey-blue cotton you've been wearing for weeks. Rose-coloured silk with little golden vines stitched on it, as if it had just proposed to you. You gaze at it. Eyes down, the servant girl murmurs from the Valide Sultan's steward. This might signify anything. Perhaps you're receiving a prize. Perhaps you're being put to the test. Perhaps it was intended for a different concubine, and now you're snooping around in someone else's assassination scheme. You've done it. It fits shadily wonderfully. The other women notice you walking through the harem halls. Not publicly, that would be beneath them, but with well-placed conversational pauses, lifted eyebrows, and a single, savage look that could sever embroidery thread. You sit with slightly more upright posture throughout the morning recitation. You act as though you're not aware that you've been positioned a little bit closer to the front, not with the wallpaper girls, but also not right next to the ones who are preferred. The rose comes next. A eunuch brings 1 pink rose to your quarters later that day. This might indicate anything in palace code. Perhaps you caught the Sultan's attention, or that's how someone wants it to appear. Or perhaps you are being prepared for the most deadly game of telephone in Ottoman history, palace gossip. The safest move. You press the rose between the pages of your prayer book and tell absolutely no one. Not even your shadow, especially not your shadow, she gossips. That night, feeling like a target within a Valentine's Day card, you go to bed covered in rose silk. Rising too soon is suspect here in the harem. It's risky to stand out, but vanishing, that's worse. Thus, you maintain your stance, drink your sherbet, and become ready for whatever this rose and robe combo may signify. Because it may be everything, or it could be nothing, and both are equally frightening here. It's not dinner in the harem. The theatre is the setting. Everyone dresses in silk and acts as though they aren't assessing their opponents in between mouthfuls of stewed lamb in this competitive, highly skilled theatre. You walk into the large dining room and sit down. Keep it away from the centre. That is not something you deserve, not too far in the dark either. You have not yet become invisible. The seating arrangement is a dynamic status map. You spend a week with the lute musician, who is privy to everyone's secrets. The next, a woman who hasn't spoken to you since 1572, is standing next to you. Silent eunuchs carry trays with the meal. Bowls of pomegranate-studded pilaf, saffron rice, grape leaves, and crystal glasses filled with luscious sherbets. It's all flavorful, sensitive, and in some ways emotionally frightening. Nobody rushes, it would be impolite. You eat slowly and elegantly as if you were a person who is fed only by poetry and intrigue and doesn't actually need food. People are whispering. Unless they're trying to convey a message, no one laughs too loudly. In this snake hole, you're confident enough to be happy. You give a courteous nod, you have a little smile. No matter what, you never beg for more bread. Weakness is hunger. Gluttony is the same. In addition, there may be someone observing to see if you take 2 figs. Across the table from you, another concubine catches your eye. She's brand new, or perhaps she is elderly and has a superior tailor in her new life. In any case, her smile is the type that comes with long-term aspirations, and her earrings are too big for her status. Before she determines you're a problem, you break eye contact. Then comes the bit that nobody ever acknowledges. Observing the eunuch come in. The air changes as he enters. You maintain your composure on the outside, even if he sends you a letter, an invitation, or anything else. Your soul may or may not be breakdancing on the inside. If he doesn't, you nod as though this is perfectly acceptable. In any case, you didn't want to be called. You're occupied with chewing dubious ornamental grapes. Nothing has transpired by the conclusion of dinner. And it's all occurred. In polite laughs and eyebrow lifts, power has shifted hands. You get up, bow, and walk away, still smiling, still hungry, and continuing playing the game. The harem at night is like a theatre stage after the show, dim, quiet, but still tense, so it's cute that you try to sleep. You lie awake wondering if a eunuch will knock on your door tonight as the lanterns flicker low and the fountains outside hum. You are aware of the guidelines. The Sultan makes decisions in secret, sometimes with purpose, sometimes on the spur of the moment, and sometimes after witnessing a girl drop a fig with a certain grace. There is only expectation and silk-robed worry, no pattern, no rationale. The other women act like they're sleeping around you. One breathes excessively loudly while another continuously adjusts her veil as if it might shield her from good fortune or terrible news. Everyone is being indifferent. You are concerned. You care, of course. 2 days ago, you received a rose, but you're still unsure if it was a warning or a compliment. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Palace correspondence resembles poetry penned by a spies committee. Then there were quiet footsteps. There's a squeak in a door. A eunuch murmurs a name somewhere. Not yours. You let out a breath. Solace? A letdown? A combination of the two presented in a sentimental silver goblet. When you close your eyes and turn over, your mind begins to enact hypothetical dialogues with the Sultan in 3 languages that you are still learning. You have dreams. Not of home, though. Now that location is hazy. In your dream, you see the woman on the other side of the dining table wearing earrings that are too big for her position. In the dream, she gives you a smile. You wake up convinced that she wants you banished, demoted, or at the very least, forced to spend the remainder of your natural life in lute training. You pretend it's soothing as you dab rose water beneath your nose. It's not. It smells like control, though. Eventually, just before sunrise, you fall asleep. You've made it through another night without being picked, without being deleted, and without unintentionally appearing overly eager or uninteresting. And that's not slumber in Topkapi's palace. It's a diplomatic triumph. In the harem, 2 stories are whispered. One is the fairy tale in which you are noticed by the Sultan, and your life is changed by wealth, power, and the odd walnut-sized diamond. The real event is the other. The ruler of a kingdom that extends from Arabia to Hungary, the Sultan, might or might not recall your name. There are hundreds like you. He might have called you because you remind him of a masterpiece he once saw, or because he needs a diversion because his coffee tasted a little too bitter. The eunuch doesn't give an explanation when he knocks on your door after dark. He merely bows. Silently, your heart beats like a royal drumline in your ears as you get up. You are guided through hallways that are fragrant with sandalwood and illuminated by lanterns. Hundreds of people have traveled this journey, but only few have come back with tales worth living. You reach a room with tile mosaics and polished brass reflecting back at you. A last servant straightens your veil, puts another drop of oil behind your ears, and gives you a look that says, "Smile, but not too much. Speak, but only if spoken to. And, for Allah's sake, don't trip." The Sultan, the guy you have studied for, feared, envisioned, and perhaps unintentionally dreamed about during Quran studies, is standing there when you go in. He has an unfathomable countenance and is dressed in silk robes. He repeats your name, not the one your mother gave you, but the new one. "Where are you from?" he asks. You lie with style, you discuss poetry. He gives a nod. After that he gives you a fig. What does it signify? This fruit, like everything else in the harem, is a metaphor. Is it a subtle sign of food choice, an invitation, or a test of refinement? You take the fig, carefully peel it, and respond with a response that sounds both sophisticated and enigmatic. Something about harshness being concealed by sweetness. You hope it sounds deep, perhaps it simply sounds hungry. The night is filled with music, chatter, and the sporadic silence that seems judgmental. When someone dismisses you, they nod. They lead you back, intact, alone, and completely confused. Things are going to get tough now that you've been discovered. Just before dawn, you return, walking more softly than normal, as though stepping too loudly could shatter whatever spell you were just under. You kind of slept. To be more precise, you sat down beside the most influential guy in the empire and made a concerted effort to avoid perspiring through your perfume. You believe you were charming? There's no doubt that you mentioned poetry. Or goats, perhaps, you're no longer certain. When you pass, the eunuchs remain silent. That's excellent. A knowing smirk is seldom better than silence. The air smells different in the harem. The corridor has the same rose oil and jasmine incense, but something new has been added. Pay attention. You feel the concubine's looks ricochet off your shoulders like ornamental daggers, but they avoid looking at you directly, since it would be rude. Your breakfast seating has been moved slightly closer to the center. You might be relevant now, albeit it's not very clear. Everyone else's sherbet is a little warmer than yours. Everything is revealed by the small pleasures. Even though you are theoretically low in the hierarchy, you are still expected to attend classes and are still in charge of folding an excessive number of embroidered towels. You're being watched, though, not by the palace guards, by everyone else. Suddenly, girls who have never spoken to you before want to discuss their favorite Persian poetry passages. In a move as delicate as placing a baby cradle in your lap, a servant unintentionally places a pomegranate, a fruit linked to fertility, on your plate. Even your adversaries learn to be more courteous. They give a small nod. But like cats watching a candle, their eyes stay keen and delighted. There is absolutely no expression from the older concubines. This is nothing new to them. 5 years ago, you were one of them. There may still be one or two. You appear impartial and spend the remainder of the day doing what the harem has taught you to do best. When someone addresses you, you speak. You have a little smile. Now that you sort of belong here, you move as though you do. The true trick, though, keeping your feelings to yourself, because your emotions are heavily exchanged for money in this palace. Now that you've climbed the palace ladder, the one that nobody discusses, everyone is scurrying up in their softest slippers. It's not leaning on a wall. Under the strain of ambition, it floats, changes, and occasionally breaks in two. The initial action? Make it through the attention. More people are whispering your name, your new Ottoman name that the government has given you. Naturally, not so loudly as to make you feel like a character in someone else's play. One day, a concubine who previously believed you were furniture compliments you on your stitching. The next, someone who would rather poison you than advertise your breakfast offers you fig paste. You gently decline. Additionally, you've been moved to a different chamber, better lighting, 2 additional cushions, and a mirror that doesn't turn your face into a medieval fresco are all features. That isn't being kind. It's a signal. Slowly, like steam in the hammam, you're rising, apparent, transient, and sometimes scorching. This is where strategic modesty, a risky balancing act, starts. You are conceited if you appear overly happy. You are manipulative if you appear overly modest. If your garments trip and you fall face first upon the prayer mat, all right, it is regrettable, but they will still discuss it. The mother of the Sultan and the head of everything glittering, the Valide Sultan, begins to take notice of you. Her steward now gives you a nod in the hallway, though not directly. That is essentially a warning or an endorsement, maybe both. Your classmates start classifying in the meantime. The silent threats, the friendly opportunists, and one frightful girl who seems to thrive only on melon and retaliation. You learn to handle them all with eyes that warn, "I will definitely outlive you," and smiles that indicate, "I respect you." One morning, pearls show up on your caftan. At the collar, little ones. A test, a present, or simply pearls. They have a high sheen and are worn with care, much like armor. Now every gesture counts. How you bow, how you walk, and how long you look someone in the eye. Flirt is not what this is. Diplomacy is what this is. You're climbing in your slippers, gently, with caution. Additionally, there are other girls who used to have pearls on the floor if you fell. There are times in palace life when your heart skips a beat. One is being called upon by the Sultan. Being recognized by the legitimate Sultan is a whole other level. She is more than simply the harem's manager. The harem is her. Builder of coalitions, preserver of customs, 1 minute a kind grandmother, the next a political maelstrom. She stares at you today too. Not a quick look. It's not a courteous nod, a full, measured, straight look. The sort of glance that implies she is aware of your origins, your destination, and your preferred method of chewing melon slices. You react in the only appropriate manner. You go into a panic, inside. On the outside, you bow with robotic accuracy, cast your eyes down just enough to be respectful but not submissive, and instantly start doubting every single thing you've worn in the last month. A steward then shows up with a message. The Valide is inviting you to help with one of their humanitarian sewing initiatives. Interpretation. In a room full of older, more astute women who can spot ambition at a distance, she wants to watch you. You get there on schedule, not too soon. It's desperate, not too late. It's suicidal. Cushions, embroidery hoops, and the kind of quiet that begs you to speak first surround her as she sits. You don't. You try to make this feel less like a job interview under the cover of domestic work. The other females converse with courtesy. The Valida pays attention. Every now and then she poses a query. Where did you receive your education? Which surah is your favorite? Have you ever encountered someone with a thorough understanding of politics? You respond thoughtfully and elegantly as though your future depended on it. Since it does. She smiles at one point. Not at you, close to you. This is essentially equivalent. After it's finished, you bow once more and leave with the composure of someone who doesn't know if they've just been promoted or put on towel duty. Your roommate is staring at you in your chamber as if you've just gotten from a dragon ride. She whispered. She looked at you. You give a slight smile as you nod. It is not spoken out loud. However, absolutely, you're still perspiring. Someone knocks on the door of your chamber, not a friend's soft knock or a towel-carrying eunuch's anxious tap. This is a purposeful knock, the sort that has repercussions. You are delivered a message. One of the Sultan's favorite consorts extends an invitation to you for a special tea. Through the harem, her name is muttered like a lullaby recited while holding a knife. Depending on who you ask, she is either your best chance of surviving or the reason why girls inexplicably vanish during lunch. She is strong and composed. You agree. Saying no in the harem is as effective as throwing a fig at a cavalry attack, so of course you do. You dress with mathematical attention to detail, not over the top. She may believe you're putting her to the test, not too simple. She may believe that you are making fun of her. You add a hairpin that reads, "I'm competent, but not plotting in yet," after settling on elegance with believable modesty. The tea room is tiny, scented, and eerily quiet. Like the person who developed reclining, she sits by herself. The threads used to embroider her robe are most likely more expensive than those in your area. She motions you to have a seat. You do it calmly, elegantly, and with a bow that conveys respect without seeming desperate. She pours her own tea that is either highly symbolic or incredibly generous, maybe both. What follows is a master class in indirect compliments and hidden threats. She claims to have heard you and that some powerful people are taking notice of you. As if you had unintentionally taken in a stray panther, she says it. When you answer, she smiles. You can't tell if she's marking you for later or if she loves your response. You discuss music, poetry, and, with caution, palace customs. She frequently nods. She occasionally looks at the door, as though deciding whether you're worth her time or simply another rising starlet in her scrapbook. She dismisses you with a smile that may make or break your career after the second cup. Tired and a little uncertain as to whether you have been quietly claimed, cautioned, or recruited, you return to your chamber. In any case, your biggest asset and newest liability is that someone very important now knows your name. You already know that in the harem, words are used sparingly and always with purpose, much like spices. You risk being exposed if you say too much. If you say too little, people will forget you. However, you become dangerous if you say just enough and let quiet do the talking. The lesson for today starts in the music room, where a group of senior concubines meet to talk about philosophy, poetry, and, let's face it, one another. Under the pretext of hospitality, you are asked to sit in rather than speak. You show up on time, make the appropriate etiquette, and fold yourself like a polite napkin into the corner. You take a drink of sherbet. Every now and again you nod. You appear curious, but not eager. You chuckle just enough to appear human at one joke. Then it occurs. One of the older women turns to face you and asks you a question. It's not a trap yet. It's just a straightforward query about your feelings regarding a lengthy verse. However, you are aware of this. They're not evaluating your poetic taste. Your timing is being tested. You hesitate just long enough to appear deliberate, but not so long that it appears you're frantically trying to think of a safe response. Then you say something that sounds thoughtful, respectful, and most importantly, ambiguous. They give a nod. They're content. You're gone. Later on, you are questioned once more, this time regarding the Valide Sultan's recent humanitarian endeavor. You don't say anything important. Without professing to be aware of the politics involved, you praise the idea's elegance. You use terms like visionary and humble. You are using phantom queens to play word chess. In actuality, the majority of power in the harem is exercised in silence, in the lingering look, in the smile that falls short of the eyes, in the silence before a response, when everyone leans in just enough to see which way the wind is blowing. After saying fewer than a dozen sentences, you exit the room. Additionally, your name appears on 3 more lips than it did the day before. You are no longer merely surviving, you're learning how to move through a world where silence speaks louder than words, with grace, precision, and elegance. What about the walls? They continue to listen. On your pillow, you discover a present, not a word, no signature, just a little velvet box, perhaps with disguised judgment, tied with a ribbon the color of dried rose petals. As with anything in the harem, you open it gently, half expecting scorpions, half anticipating scent. It's a piece of jewelry, a beautiful bracelet with gold and turquoise filigree inlay. Lovely, classy, unsettling, for nothing in this place is ever merely a gift. You look around the room. Your roommate's eyebrows go up. She doesn't inquire. She either has a strong interest in plausible deniability or is really courteous. The bracelet is very pricey, too costly for an inconspicuous memento, not from the Sultan, but not quite regal enough. This makes it clear that the person is rich, cunning, and eager to steer the story. Or you put it on. You do, of course. The game is that the rumors start around mid-morning. Someone murmurs by the fountain, "She got a gift." Whom does someone else respond? The solution is in what she didn't say. This is equivalent to suggesting that everyone should choose the most intriguing or worse alternative in this situation. You keep your expression, a serene mixture of mild boredom, bewilderment, and modesty. In the meantime, your inner monologue is circling back and forth over all of your previous conversations, looking for adversaries, allies, and anyone who has a penchant for turquoise. By midday, the rumors have changed. Allegedly, the Valid Sultan herself has given you an artifact, a secret message, and a concealed proposal. All false, all dangerously plausible. Then the warning is whispered. A low-ranking, easily ignored servant girl mutters and lowers your tray, being cautious about who puts items in your hands when she is unable to speak directly to you. When someone subtly alerts you to potential sabotage while acting awkward, you respond by thanking her. You sleep with the bracelet tucked beneath your pillow as a precaution, but you keep it on. A gift is rarely an expression of affection in the harem. It can be a label, a test, a leash, or just a subtle reminder that people are calling your name in places you haven't yet visited. And sometimes, showing that someone wants to claim you rather than a smile is the most hazardous thing you can wear. You are called one morning right before the call to prayer. A letter sealed in the royal blue wax, given with no explanation, just a glance that says everything is about to change, rather than by a eunuch or a servant. You read it by yourself. It's a beautiful script. The offer is unambiguous. The Sultan will be nearer to you, you will be transferred to more private quarters, you will be closer to the center of the palace, and you will be removed from anonymity. On paper, it's a promotion. However, a promotion is only a fancier phrase for exposure in the harem. Once you accept, you enter the realm of genuine influence. Politics, intrigue, the potential to become a consort, have a royal child, or perhaps be the Sultan's favorite. Some ladies have this as their dream. Women also disappear there. You have till dusk to respond, thus you stroll through the gardens where you once hid from older concubines. They appear smaller now, the fountains continue to murmur. Like fragile secrets, the tulips continue to bloom. The air feels different, though. They're speaking your name now. Home comes to mind, hazily now. You consider the other girls, the ones who were smart, but not smart enough, the ones who ascended too quickly, and the ones who never rose at all. You imagine yourself as the girl who came with her previous name tucked away between her ribs, rather than the version of yourself that has been taught in manners and poetry. You dress carefully that evening. One last option. You answer in the silence as you pass the velvet borders and curtains that divide the known from the unknown. Perhaps you soar, perhaps you disappear, Perhaps your name is inscribed in the history of the palace, or perhaps it is spoken one final time and stored away like a silk scarf in a drawer that no one ever opens. However, one thing is for sure, you weren't merely ornamental, you were a master of restraint, a strategist in satin and a survivor in perfume, and you managed to stay afloat while walking the tightrope between danger and power for a full day, if not longer. The ancient world had its own Amazons long before comic novels and Hollywood blockbusters, and they were frightfully real. Meet the Scythian women, warriors of the Eurasian steppe who rode horses and wielded bows and who did more than simply challenge gender expectations. They rode right over them after reloading. The Scythians were a nomadic people who lived in regions of Central Asia, southern Russia, and what is now Ukraine. The powerful Amazonian women who mated with Scythian men and gave birth to a tribe of warriors were described by the Greek historian Herodotus. For years, academics attributed that to Greek creativity and excessive alcohol consumption. Recent archaeology, however, provides bone-deep evidence for a different scenario. The remains of women buried in full warrior attire have been discovered during excavations of Scythian burial mounds, also known as kurgans. Arrow quivers, swords, spears, and even scars from combat. Arrowheads buried in the vertebrae of one teen's skeleton, found in the Altai region, are a tragic but indisputable indication that she fought and lost her life in battle. Some were buried in armored coffins with their horses. These were worn and used, not ceremonial props. Women were expected to fight in this culture, not merely permitted to do so. In contrast to the majority of its ancient peers, Scythian civilization was not inflexibly patriarchal. Women frequently hunted and raided with men. Elite ladies may occupy influential roles, and girls were taught to ride and shoot from an early age. There are also indications that Scythian priestesses were respected in ritual and feared in combat because they possessed spiritual influence. The Greeks were appalled as well as captivated. They gave rise to the legend of the Amazons, untamed warrior women who lived aloof from society and detested men. However, their interactions with the Scythians formed the basis of the mythology. These women did not fit the Greek ideal of the subservient domestic woman. They were mythologized because they were powerful and strange. The next time someone claims that female warriors are merely a mythical cliché, tell them that the Scythians were around 2,500 years before us, and beneath the steppe their legacy is inscribed in iron-tipped realities and skeletons wounded by arrows, not in folklore. You haven't met the African queens if you believe that leadership on the battlefield is just a male domain. These were no silk-clad, pampered palace types. These were war-hardened leaders who stared down empires without flinching, led armies, and negotiated accords. Additionally, they redefined combat rather than only taking part in it. For instance, Queen Amanirenas of Kush, after conquering Egypt in the 1st century BCE, the Roman Empire made the strategic mistake of attempting to expand its influence into Nubia to the south. Amanirenas, a queen with one eye who had previously engaged in combat, had different ideas. She organized her troops, mounted several retaliatory assaults, and even took control of Roman forts. A single statue of Augustus, a gloriously unsubtle message, she had it severed and buried beneath her temple steps. Rome eventually withdrew and engaged in peace talks. Yes, exactly. A one-eyed warrior queen was not alone when one of the greatest empires in history had to make amends with her. Female leaders frequently served as military commanders throughout Africa. During the 16th century, Queen Amina of Zazzau led horse attacks into Hausa territory in what is now Nigeria. Oral tradition states that she ruled over a larger area than any previous or subsequent ruler. Amina created trade lines, erected fortifications around cities, and, above all, never allowed her gender to restrict her power on the battlefield. She was admired by her warriors not just because she was queen, but also because she was likely to be able to outfight the majority of them. The Agoge, an all-female military unit later known as the Dahomey Amazons by the French, guarded the kingdom of Dahomey further south. These guards were not symbolic. They were frontline combatants who had received discipline, endurance, and weaponry training since they were young. They frequently led combat charge and functioned as elite royal guardians. According to some stories, they were even more violent than their male counterparts, which could be attributed to their enjoyment of their jobs or the fact that they had more to prove. Rare exceptions did not apply to these women. Women were expected to possess political, economic, and military skills in many African nations. They led soldiers, fought against conquest, and engaged in negotiations with colonists. Their existence was cultural rather than radical. You might want to add, yeah, but some of those swords were held by queens. The next time someone claims that men wielding swords wrote history, male soldiers in bronze armor going forth to fight is typically what you see when you imagine ancient Greece or Rome at war. A different type of warrior, however, who didn't wear a tunic into battle, but instead took up a weapon as the city gates were about to fall, can be found if you linger behind the front lines. Women were frequently compelled to play defense roles in both Greek and Roman society, and they jumped at the chance. Women were formally prohibited from serving in the military in classical Athens. They primarily played symbolic, religious, or household functions. However, those distinctions quickly became hazy when invaders showed up. Greek women, for instance, provided logistical help during the Persian Wars by carrying supplies, tending to the injured, and in extreme situations, hurling roof tiles from the city walls onto enemy soldiers. It wasn't exactly the glitzy side of combat, but it had an impact. One such instance is the siege of Plataea in 429 BCE. Despite not being trained soldiers, Thucydides claims that women who were trapped inside the city took up guns and battled alongside the remaining defenders. They were once citizens who became combatants. However, battle does not always wait for preparation. Women were officially prohibited from serving in the military in ancient Rome. Nevertheless, stories of women assuming leadership roles when things broke down abound throughout Roman history. Women apparently engaged in negotiations with the Gauls during their 390 BCE siege of Rome, donated their jewelry to support defense operations, and assisted in boosting morale. Roman women frequently accompanied their husbands to military camps during later conflicts, such as the Second Punic War, and some even served as unofficial consultants or strategists. The 410 CE sack of Rome is the subject of one especially noteworthy story. Noblewomen are reported to have armed their servants, organized resistance inside the urban pandemonium, and opened their estates as havens while Alaric's Visigoths overran the city. These were no helpless victims. They actively participated in both survival and defense. Warfare in the ancient world involved more than just swordplay on a battlefield. Women were right in the middle of it, protecting their homes when no one else could. It was fought with quick thought, bravery, and occasionally pure desperation. In the year 60 CE, if you were a Roman governor in Britain, Boudica was the name of your worst nightmare. She was more than a monarch. She was a force of fire, rage, and vengeance who had a talent for inspiring a whole populace of irate Britons to rebel openly against the most powerful empire in the world. In eastern Britain, the Orsini tribe was governed by Boudica. In an effort to maintain peace, her husband, King Prasutagus, gave his realm to his daughters and the Roman Empire jointly after his death. Being Rome, they disregarded the will, seized the land altogether, publicly flogged Boudica, and, in a horrifying event that is still talked about today, had her daughters beaten. This went beyond just political dominance. Boudica would have none of it. It was humiliation. What came next was no small uprising. It was a full-scale conflict. Leading a coalition of tribes in a scorched earth campaign that rocked Roman rule to its foundation, Boudicca became the face of the rebellion. First stop, the completely destroyed Roman town of Camulodunum, which is now Colchester. After that, Londinium, present-day London, burned to ashes. Modern-day St. Albans, Verulamium, suffers the same fate. She was towering and fearsome, with a mane of red hair and a ferocious presence that sent her men into a frenzy, according to the Roman historian Cassius Dio. Tacitus, on the other hand, highlighted her leadership and eloquence, noting how she spoke to her soldiers as a mother wronged and a warrior awoken rather than as a noblewoman. Despite her early successes, Boudicca's army ultimately ran into a skilled Roman army led by Governor Suetonius Paulinus. The rebels were defeated because they were outnumbered and ill-prepared. The sources differ on whether Boudicca was poisoned or killed in combat. However, her loss did not lessen her influence. The lesson was learned by the Romans. Their interactions with tribal leaders were more circumspect, and the name of the lady who rocked an empire was never forgotten. Boudicca's rebellion was more than a simple rebellion. It served as a warning that downtrodden people can turn into the most destructive force in the world if they are led by someone who has nothing left to lose. And in this instance, that force was a mother with a long memory and a war chariot. The samurai is nearly invariably portrayed as masculine in feudal Japanese folklore. A death-loyal stoic warrior with a sword in hand, dressed in lacquered armor. But if you look behind the Bushido scrolls and cherry blossoms, you'll see another kind of samurai, one made of steel and silk. In addition to being real, the onobugeisha, or women warriors, were also lethal. These noble women were the unseen core of many samurai clans, trained in strategy, archery, and martial arts. In contrast to their male counterparts, they were not usually put into open-field combat. However, they fought fearlessly and frequently without mercy when their houses, castles, or family honor were on the line. Tomoe Gozen, a fighter from the 12th century, who participated in the Genpei War, is among the most famous onobugeisha. According to the Heike Monogatari, Japan's epic of honor and war, Tomoe was a superb archer and rider who could kill men with a single katana stroke. Wearing full armor, her long black hair trailed behind her like a war flag as she rode into combat like a tempest. Before vanishing from history like a ghost on horseback, she is said to have decapitated a rival samurai in single combat during the Battle of Owazu. Next is Nakano Takeko, who fought in the Boshin War in the 19th century. Since women were not officially permitted in the imperial army, she organized her own regiment, an unauthorized corps of female fighters who used pole weapons and naginata. She was shot in the chest and died while leading an assault on imperial forces. In order to prevent the enemies from claiming her body, she made one final request: to be buried with honor by her sister. These women were part of the martial heritage that upheld the principles of Bushido, loyalty, bravery, and self-sacrifice. They were neither tokens nor legends. In times of war, some even had the same training as their male counterparts. Naturally, the onobugeisha were marginalized and their tales were relegated to folklore as Japan industrialized and concentrated its military might. However, the facts are still in place. Women's blades were honed just as frequently and with equal deadly force in Japan's bloody history of samurai battles and castle sieges. The Roman Colosseum, a monument to brutality, amusement, and violence fueled by testosterone. Slaves, lions, spears, and sweaty men engaged in deadly conflict. However, what if we told you that the fighters weren't always men? The lesser-known reality of female gladiators or gladiatrices lies behind the myth of the Roman gladiator. These women really exist, but they weren't there to offer refreshments despite their rarity. They trained at the same seedy gladiator schools, battled in front of thunderous crowds, and were frequently regarded with both titillation and fear. The shock value of women in combat was adored by Roman emperors, particularly the more theatrically oriented like Nero and Domitian. Yes, female gladiators were new, but they were also strong fighters in their own right. The evidence is powerful despite being dispersed. Halicarnassus's marble relief depicts Amazon and Achillea, two women engaged in fight. They even battled to a draw, which was seen as an honorable result, according to the carving. Nor were their names chosen at random. They conjured up images of female warriors from folklore, portraying them as fierce equals rather than helpless copycats. They are also mentioned in literary texts. Never one to pass judgment, the adolescent humorist ridiculed affluent women who trained like gladiators, implying that it was a scandalous abandonment of femininity. Others, such as Suetonius, point out that women fighters occasionally made an appearance in spectacles at night, fueled by wine-soaked crowds and illuminated by torches, which weren't exactly the ideal setting for a contemplative demonstration of martial prowess. However, the threat wasn't fictitious, and the instruction was genuine. Like male gladiators, these women battled with swords, tridents, and nets, and they suffered the same amount of blood. They were frequently criminals sent to the arena, slaves, or prisoners of war. Some octorati, or volunteers, opted to be gladiators in order to gain notoriety, gain wealth, or avoid worse circumstances, possibly concerned that Rome's preference for female combatants was growing a little too unconventional, or possibly because women were becoming too skilled at it. Emperor Septimius Severus outlawed women from gladiator combat entirely in 200 AD. The gladiatrices thus created a vicious, blood-stained area of their own, even if they did not control the Colosseum. Gender had little meaning on the sand. Survival, skill, and ferocity were crucial. The medieval battlefield was more than simply a chainmail-clad boys' club. Although the majority of women were excluded from official combat duties, some deliberately disregarded or failed to receive the letter. Medieval women discovered methods to fight both literally and metaphorically, whether it was by dressing like men, leading troops as abbesses, or just refusing to remain in the convent when swords began to swing. The warrior nuns are among the most peculiar groups of warrior women. Some religious ladies did more than pray for victory during the Crusades. They grabbed weapons. There are records of abbesses and nuns assuming leadership when their convents or territories were in danger. However, the majority did so defensively. As the ruler of a strong ecclesiastical realm in the 12th century, the abbess of Quedlinburg led vassals in combat and served as a spiritual and military leader. Despite her lack of armor, she gave instructions like a commander. Then, at least on paper, some women just changed their gender to male. Several instances of women dressing like men to join armies are documented in medieval chronicles. While some were apprehended and put to death, others remained undiscovered for years. The tale of John, a woman who served in an English garrison during the 100 Years' War, serves as one illustration. She apparently fought as hard as her comrades, so when they found her, they shrugged and let her to continue. The headliner of this category is, of course, Joan of Arc, a teenage peasant girl who led the French army to triumphs that astounded Europe, dressed in men's armor, and claimed to have had divine visions. However, for every Joan, there were dozens of anonymous women who had only opportunity and fortitude instead of sainthood or visions. Women played tactical roles, even off the battlefield. In castles under siege, noble women frequently oversaw defenses, rationed supplies, and engaged in negotiations with the enemy. Although she wasn't a sword-wielding warrior, Eleanor of Aquitaine went on crusades with her husband and was said to have donned armor, whether for show, protection, or statement, though this is still up for debate. What's the point? Contrary to popular belief, the Middle Ages were not a homogeneous period. Women sneaked around the regulations, created new ones, or identified weaknesses in inflexible systems. Additionally, history felt their presence on the battlefield even though it didn't always write down their names. People may picture experts debating philosophy and science, caliphs in opulent courts, or flowing robes when they think of the Islamic civilization of the Middle Ages. What do they frequently overlook? When males were too sluggish, too dead, or too preoccupied with politics, it was the women who took up swords, commanded armies, and protected towns. Consider the name Khawla bint al-Azwa, which continues to reverberate like a battle cry in Arab legend. She accompanied her brother in combat during the early Muslim conquests in the 7th century. She attacked the enemy lines in black armor after he was taken by Byzantine forces, holding her sword so accurately that soldiers thought she was Khalid ibn al-Walid, the renowned general known as the Sword of Allah. Morale remained high once her identity was made public. It flew. Her ability and courage had earned her a position among the warriors. Khawla and other women weren't merely oddities on the battlefield. Women took up arms to protect their homes and towns during times of crisis, particularly during sieges. There are stories of women battling in the streets of Nishapur and other cities during the 13th century Mongol invasions, when the Khwarezmian Empire was collapsing. They are said to have thrown stones, wielded daggers, and transformed their homes into castles. Although they never had any official training, desperation is a potent instructor. Nobility in Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain, to the west, were also not cloistered. Some had significant military and political clout. Despite being most recognized as a poet, Walada bint al-Mustakfi lived in a society where women of her class frequently owned estates and protected them from public turmoil. During the Reconquista a few decades later, Muslim women occasionally accompanied their husbands in defending Granada's remaining castles. Another is Sayyida al-Hurra, a pirate queen rather than a combatant. She led fleets in the western Mediterranean during the 16th century, terrifying European vessels. She was a political figure and naval commander who was allied with the notorious Barbarossa of the Ottoman Navy. She posed a menace both ashore and at sea. The requirement and the ideal of modesty coexisted in many Islamic communities. The veil came off and the sword out when armies faltered and cities burnt. And in those times, history recalled them as fighters who rewrote the rules, not as women who disobeyed them. History books taught us for generations that men were meant for conflict. While women waited, cried, or dressed wounds in the background, men led, fought, and died valiantly. However, as you delve further, a different narrative emerges, an account of women who jumped at the chance to participate in the combat. They frequently showed more bravery than glory when they crashed the battlefield. Every continent has stories of female fighters, from the Scythian horse archers who probably sparked the Amazon myth, to African queens who outwitted empires, to female gladiators who drew blood in the sand. Sometimes, like Queen Amina or Boudica, they were born leaders. Sometimes ordinary people, like the just courage, the refusal to be erased, stepped up when chaos left no other choice. These women's legacy is determined by how many rules they broke rather than how many battles they won. They disregarded political limits, religious precepts, and cultural conventions. They compelled chroniclers, emperors, and generals to reevaluate their presumptions. That frequently meant being purposefully removed from the record. What empire, after all, wants to acknowledge that a woman brandishing a spear shook it? Still, the evidence can be found in temple murals, songs, oral traditions, poems, bones interred with weapons, and scribbled notes by historians unsure of how to interpret them. Though not always complete or praised, the tale endured long enough to motivate succeeding generations. Only recently has the scope of women's contributions to fighting been completely recognized in modern military history. Recognizing that women were always there in combat, even when they weren't meant to be, is more important than elevating them above males. Remind them of this the next time someone claims that women in combat are an exception. Women weren't only a part of the battle story, from the chariot charges to the castle sieges, from the icy steppes of Central Asia to the dunes of North Africa. They were the secret edge and the narrative twist. Since a sword only cares about what the person carrying it is willing to do with it once it is drawn, the blade history attempted to sheath but was never successful. On April 26, 121 CE, Marcus Aurelius was born in Rome, the center of an empire that spanned from Britain to the Arabian desert. At birth, his full name was Marcus Annius Verus, and he was descended from a noble family with strong senatorial ties. In other words, he wasn't starting from scratch. His grandfather had been a consul, and his family was rich in both riches and political ties. But young Marcus wasn't pampered by affluence. Even as a child, he had a reputation for being exceptionally serious, quiet, and introspective, the sort of kid who probably missed out on the toy swords and asked philosophical questions instead. This melancholy, introspective boy caught the attention of Emperor Hadrian, who identified in him a unique quality: integrity. He gave Marcus the nickname Verissimus, which means most truthful, and distinguished him for a destiny that few people could imagine. After the untimely death of Hadrian's original choice for heir, Hadrian adopted Antoninus Pius with the stipulation that Antoninus would thereafter choose Marcus Aurelius as his heir. In an instant, Marcus found himself on a slow, duty-laden path to ultimate authority. His schooling was of the highest caliber. He received instruction in philosophy, rhetoric, and Greek and Latin literature from tutors. Marcus, on the other hand, approached his lessons with religious fervor, particularly Stoicism, whereas many young nobles treated them like chores. He interpreted Epictetus and Seneca as a moral compass rather than as abstract theory. For him, philosophy was a guide to living, not a game of thought. He began fasting, wearing basic clothes, and sleeping on a rough floor. He wanted to harden his soul, not because anyone told him to. Under Antoninus Pius's diligent guidance, Marcus gained patience as well as knowledge of government over the years. For more than 20 years, Antoninus reigned with serene efficiency, while Marcus watched every action and choice like a student getting ready for a test he knew would eventually be taken. Marcus saw power as a duty he would never be able to escape, one that required self-control, self-denial, and most importantly, moral clarity, in contrast to many heirs who yearn for the throne. In other words, Rome was getting ready to install a philosopher as king rather than a playboy prince. Marcus Aurelius eventually succeeded to the throne after Antoninus Pius passed away in 161 CE. As usual, though, he didn't celebrate his victory. Rather, he demanded right away that his adoptive brother Lucius Verus share authority. It was a pragmatic and modestly motivated political move. Rome was simply too big, too complicated, and, to be honest, too burning to be ruled by one man, not even a philosopher. In practically every aspect, Lucius Verus was Marcus's antithesis. Verus enjoyed lavish parties and gladiator bouts, but Marcus was quiet and orderly. Lucius employed performers and chefs, while Marcus studied philosophy by candlelight. Nevertheless, the collaboration was more successful than anticipated, mostly because Lucius oversaw the military and Marcus remained focused on governance. And there were plenty of military crises in ancient Rome. Rome's eastern competitor, the Parthian Empire, felt it was time for some drama a few months into their joint rule. Marcus was in charge of logistics and supplies, while Lucius Verus directed the campaign. The Romans prevailed in the war, which stretched on for several years. Win-win then? Not exactly, actually. In addition to honor, the returning armies also brought sickness. the empire was hit by a strange plague that is today thought to have been either smallpox or measles. An estimated 5 million individuals were killed by the Antonine Plague, including a sizable portion of the Roman army. Panic spread, crops failed, and cities wilted, and they became worse just when it seemed impossible. Seeing Rome's vulnerability, Germanic tribes along the Danube frontier began to aggressively push against the boundaries. Rome was under attack from all sides: political upheaval, sickness, and war. Just a few months into his reign, Marcus was already enmeshed in disaster. After Lucius Verus passed away in 169 CE, most likely from the plague, Marcus was left to rule alone, bearing the entire burden of the globe. The majority of monarchs would have fallen, but Marcus, who was composed, introspective, and unyielding, regarded hardship as a challenge, a fire to be fought rather than avoided. He didn't back down or complain. He resorted to his stoic beliefs and confronted Rome's deteriorating structure with silent determination. After all, Marcus saw his role as emperor as a duty, no matter how painful, rather than a chance for personal glory. Marcus Aurelius had exchanged his senatorial toga for a soldier's cloak by the early 170s CE. With Rome's defences weakened by the previous disease, the Germanic tribes, particularly the Marcomanni, Quadi, and Sarmatians, were flooding across the Danube frontier. This was not a catastrophe that Marcus handled from a marble palace. He led from the front lines like a general, not a philosopher monarch, and rode north, made camp, and remained there year after year. Marcus wrote Meditations, one of the most subtly revolutionary books in history, while living in these difficult frontier conditions: mud, cold, disease, and constant danger. He didn't write it for his heirs, for fame, or even for publication. He used it as a private record, a philosophical diary, to remind himself how to maintain his morality, reason, and composure in a crazy world. Marcus constructed an inner citadel where former emperors had constructed triumphal arches. One minute he was conversing with tribal leaders, the next he was surveying fortifications. He was writing things like, "You have power over your mind, not outside events." In the next, "If you understand this, you'll find strength." That wasn't the plan for the campaign, it was only upkeep. The conflicts were violent. The Germanic tribes were not to be taken lightly. They were desperate, employed guerrilla warfare, and were familiar with the area. Marcus persisted, however, modifying Roman military strategies, rearranging legions and making difficult decisions, such as offering military positions to slaves and non-Romans in return for their allegiance. While traditionalists complained, Marcus seemed unconcerned. Not bloodlines, but bodies were what he required. Marcus refused to become ruthless in the face of relentless coercion. He frequently chose diplomacy over the scorched-earth tactics that his generals advocated. He prohibited needless killing when cities were captured. He gave land and autonomy rather than annihilation to tribes that surrendered. He adhered to stoic ideals even while fighting, much like a guy holding onto a raft during a storm. He was aware of the irony. The man who preferred peace to grandeur had grown to be one of Rome's most seasoned rulers. He handled it all with sad grace nevertheless. He was not battling for glory or conquest. In addition to defending a collapsing empire, he was battling to see if philosophy could withstand the blood and grime of everyday life. It might, spoiler alert. Marcus Aurelius led legions and dealt with border invasions, but it was his pen, rather than a sword, that left his most lasting imprint. Marcus started penning what are now known as Meditations, a compilation of intensely intimate thoughts on life, virtue, suffering, and death, amid tents, snow, and the moans of injured warriors. He wrote it with no intention of impressing anyone. These weren't propaganda or public statements. To him they served as reminders, notes from a man frantically attempting to maintain his humanity while ruling over a planet in disarray, mental armor. Don't waste any more time debating what makes a good man. Become one. That isn't the voice of a gloating emperor. That person is reminded himself to live honorably even when no one else is around. An ongoing internal conflict is revealed in the text. Marcus fought against his own urges as well as Germanic tribes, desperation, pride, and anger. He tells himself not to expect gratitude in one section. Even emperors are forgotten dust, he muses in another. He writes, "You will soon have forgotten everything, and everything will have forgotten you." Unless you're a Stoic, this is cheery stuff. After all, Stoicism was not about happiness or dominance. It was about choosing morality at every turn and embracing truth, no matter how harsh. For Marcus, that meant carrying out his duties, being present, exercising just leadership, and avoiding losing his head when wars and diseases turned the world upside down. He wasn't attempting to avoid pain, he was making a good effort to suffer. Quotations from Epictetus and other Stoic sages abound throughout Meditations, which was written in Greek, the intellectual language of the day. It's startlingly modern, though. Burnout was a concern for Marcus. He counseled himself to be composed with challenging individuals. He told himself that death is inevitable, pleasure is overrated, and celebrity is short-lived. It's similar to the original self-help ebook, except without the affiliate link and the happy influencer. Meditation's humanity is what sets it apart. Even though he frequently doubted it, the most powerful man in the world was sitting by candlelight trying to be good. He didn't advocate for excellence. He advocated for effort, the endeavor to remain fair, compassionate, and logical in the face of illness, conflict, treachery, and death. His remarks are still relevant today because of this, because Marcus ruled more than just Rome. He was in charge of himself. Marcus Aurelius had a less than peaceful personal life while he was occupied with controlling invasions and using philosophy to preserve inner calm. In a political marriage that appeared to be affectionate on paper, he wed Faustina the Younger, the daughter of Emperor Antoninus Pius. They had 13 kids together. 13, however, young lives were not treated well in ancient Rome. Few of them made it past infancy. 8 of Marcus's own children were buried. Take a moment to picture that. A man who wrote about impermanence every day had to live it repeatedly. Although these personal losses are rarely mentioned explicitly in Meditations, the tone, somber, determined, and aching, hints at grief that is hardly contained. Pain was not eliminated by Stoicism. It only provided him with the means to endure it. Then there was the Faustina drama. She was charged with everything from treason to infidelity by Roman historians, who were frequently more interested in rumor than facts. She allegedly conspired against Marcus and had affairs with soldiers and gladiators, according to Cassius Dio and the infamously scandalous Historia Augusta. Marcus, however, never denounced her in public. In fact, he honored her memory with statues, coins, and temples upon her death in 175 CE. He either chose forgiveness over scandal or didn't think the rumors were true. Family conflicts, however, did not stop there. Commodus, the only surviving son, was being prepared for leadership. To put it simply, Commodus's temperament and philosophy were not those of his father. Young Commodus was apparently more interested in ostentatious performances, wrestling matches, and self-glorification than Marcus was in writing meditations on humility and self-control. Marcus, however, held fast to the Roman custom of inherited succession. Marcus refused to deviate from tradition, even though there were indications that Commodus would be a risky decision. In 177 CE, he appointed Commodus co-emperor, a move that would have a lasting negative impact on his reputation. Pressures increased both domestically and internationally. Marcus hardly ever experienced calm, either because of his own sadness or because of the pandemonium around him. However, he never stopped performing his tasks. He persisted in stabilizing an empire plagued by change and deterioration on all sides, promoting philosophical ideas and enacting legislative reforms. Marcus Aurelius maintained his composure, dedication, and most importantly, humanity throughout it all. A king who was continually put to the test not only by the sword, but also by the burden of legacy, love, and loss. Marcus Aurelius had to deal with betrayal, which is particularly painful when it originates from within the tent, on top of plagues, invasions, and family tragedies. A well-known general by the name of Avidius Cassius proclaimed himself emperor in 175 CE. This was no small-scale provincial uprising. Marcus had placed a great deal of military trust in Cassius, the governor of Syria. Furthermore, it wasn't totally his fault. Cassius had heard a false rumor. Marcus had passed away. Cassius hurried rather than check the facts. In an attempt to take control before the Senate or other legions intervened, he accepted the imperial title. Running ahead of Roman news was a quintessential example of Roman ambition. Civil war was anticipated in the east. Marcus, though, he remained calm. He didn't shout treachery. He just started getting ready for a march east, not for revenge, but for peace. Marcus even thought about forgiving Cassius, which is unbelievable. He supported clemency and putting unity ahead of pride. His writings and reflections reveal a guy who is prepared to stop further violence, even if it means pardoning a man who attempted to usurp his throne. Maintaining composure in the face of personal insults as well as turmoil was the epitome of stoicism. Marcus, however, was never given the opportunity to show that mercy. His own officers, probably terrified of what the emperor's coming would imply for them, killed Cassius before he could make it to the east. Marcus received his head as a present. Marcus apparently cried. Marcus saw rebellion as more than a challenge to Rome's rule. It was a catastrophe. It represented the eroding foundation of imperial allegiance and the encroaching instability that would ultimately suffocate the empire. Following the uprising, Marcus traversed the eastern provinces in a ceremonial manner rather than in a fit of wrath. He conducted public rituals, reinforced allegiance, and made sure that nobody misinterpreted his intentions, especially the military. However, the empire was becoming more and more fractured. The populace was hollowed out by the epidemic. The borders continued to bleed. Even Rome's inner circle was now starting to fall apart. Despite seeing it all, Marcus continued to trust in morality, justice, and reason. One stoic breath at a time, he attempted to patch Rome back together, even as it started to fall apart. Marcus Aurelius was not lounging in a marble mansion or resting on his laurels as he neared the end of his life. Once more, he found himself on the frontier, deeply involved in military operations against the Danube's Germanic tribes. Because duty never stops, and neither did Marcus, he returned to the battlefield despite his advanced age and failing health. Roman resources and morale had been depleted by the protracted Marcomannic wars. Marcus was aware that land was not the only factor at play. It was a matter of survival. Raids by the Germanic tribes were not a pastime. As part of a chain reaction that would ultimately result in the collapse of Rome centuries later, they were being driven southward by other migrant groups. However, Marcus continued to exert every effort to maintain the line throughout the 170s CE. In between conflicts, he continued to write philosophical thoughts, reorganized the frontier defenses, and reintegrated refugee tribes as devoted Roman allies. He tells himself, "Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years," in one unsettling line from Meditations. Death looms upon you. These were not idle thoughts. They were the thoughts of a man who knew quite well that he was going to die soon. Marcus Aurelius became gravely ill in 180 CE when stationed in modern-day Vienna, most likely as a result of the same illness that plagued his rule. Sources claim that he called his son Commodus to his side and gave him counsel regarding his loss to history, whether it be practical, philosophical, or desperate. We do know, however, that Marcus passed away soon after on March 17th, 180 CE, surrounded by troops rather than senators or scribes. The Pax Romana, or Roman peace, as many historians refer to it, came to an end with his death. It also signaled the end of the philosopher-king era in Rome. As a spoiler, Commodus was not Marcus and would take the throne. The gradual disintegration of Marcus's legacy and the silent closing of his eyes would mark the beginning of Rome's decline, rather than a spectacular one. A dying emperor in a frigid northern frontier was doing what he always did, enduring, thinking, and carrying out his duties until the very end. There was no triumphal procession or sweeping farewell address. Marcus didn't look to monuments for immortality. He pursued it via character, and he was successful in doing so. Throughout his life, Marcus Aurelius advocated for reason, discipline, and moderation. The gods gave him Commodus, of course. Marcus died in 180 CE, leaving the empire to a 19-year-old who appeared more interested in gladiatorial cosplay than stoic virtue. Because humility obviously passed a generation, Commodus enjoyed dressing up as Hercules, fighting in the arena, and calling himself the Roman Hercules. This was disastrous, not just embarrassing. Rome plunged into debauchery, paranoia, and administrative turmoil under Commodus. He engaged in extravagant shows, alienated the Senate, and arbitrarily put rivals to death. Commodus viewed power as a reality show prize, whereas Marcus had viewed it as a sacred duty. The subject has plagued historians ever since bread and circuses became the norm. Why did the contemplative emperor and wise philosopher Marcus entrust the empire to a guy like this? Was it love without sight, a poor decision, or did Marcus feel he had no other option since he was so enmeshed in tradition and the Roman concept of dynastic continuity? Marcus actually had choices. He had the option of selecting a competent senator or general to succeed him. Adopting a deserving heir would have allowed him to defy convention, just as Emperor Nerva had done. However, he didn't. In 177 CE, he appointed Commodus co-emperor, maybe in the hopes that his son would follow suit. In case you missed it, he didn't. The fact that the emperor, who penned Meditations, a timeless treatise on human nature, was unable or unwilling to stop his own son from becoming the archetype of imperial failure is one of the great ironies of ancient history. Marcus was also aware of his son's shortcomings. Even in his works, there are indications of disillusionment and caution over flattery, pride, and indulgence, qualities that Commodus enthusiastically embraced. Marcus, however, never rejected him. He passed the torch, whether out of duty, love, or tiredness, and then watched as the home burned down. Rome would enter the year of the 5 emperors after Commodus's assassination, which would mark the end of his reign. It is a depressing conclusion to a reign characterized by stoic fortitude. Marcus's foresight and determination had preserved the empire together. Commodus ripped everything apart with pomp and ego. However, this is also where the most important Stoic lesson might be found. Emperors, too, have no control over the future, only how they respond to it. Even though Marcus Aurelius passed away about 2 millennia ago, his impact has endured. He was a unique type of leader who was a man of principles as well as power. One of the most cherished intellectual writings in history, his reflections were written during battles and restless nights, and have withstood the fall of empires, the emergence of faiths, and the test of time. His legacy is contradictory. He experienced unrelenting conflict, pestilence, uprisings, and personal tragedy in his role as emperor. However, he is still respected for his intellect, self-control, compassion, and reluctance to be tainted by total authority, rather than for his triumphs or monuments. He did not claim to be God. He made no demands for worship. He wrote about how to be a better human being in simple Greek. Consider every action you do in life to be your final one. Marcus Aurelius is still cited by contemporary figures, including CEOs, statesmen, psychologists, and sports. His comments can be found in business manuals, therapy sessions, posters, and private moments of difficulty. Why? Because his speech was not that of a monarch. He spoke as a flawed human, striving frantically to maintain his integrity in a world that was falling apart. Marcus left behind a bittersweet legacy, nevertheless. His rule signaled the end of Rome's golden period, notwithstanding his wisdom. The collapse was sped further by his son Commodus, and subsequent emperors hardly ever matched his dignity or self-control. Marcus seems to have been the empire's final moral compass before the fever struck. The fact that the man who knew impermanence best than anybody left behind something oddly permanent may be the most eerie aspect of his tale. His bloodline weakened and his dominion fell, but his unrefined, private and raw reflections endured. It was never intended for them to survive. They were never prepared for an audience or edited, and they are immortal because of it. They are the innermost thoughts of a public figure, the journal of an emperor who aspired to live a good life, die a fair death, and leave the world in a better state than when he found it. And perhaps that's all any of us can do in the end. One stoic breath at a time, Marcus did it while riding a horse in sandals and holding a stylus. Justice was not merely administered by monarchs in ancient Babylon, rather it was engraved in stone for everyone to see. A towering stela with the Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest and most significant legal systems in human history, was commissioned by King Hammurabi in 1754 BCE. The black basalt monolith, which stood more than 7 feet tall and was carved in cuneiform letters, was intended to convey authority and order. It warned in addition to governing. There were 282 provisions in the Code of Hammurabi that addressed everything from theft and violence to family and business problems. It wasn't democratic, though. These rules mirrored a strict, hierarchical society in which the severity of punishments differed greatly based on one's social standing. An obvious example of the notorious eye for an eye strategy was when a nobleman broke the bone of another nobleman, and the punishment was to have his own bone broken. However, the punishment was only a fine if the same aristocrat fractured the bone of a slave or commoner. In this system, justice was based on the rank of the offender as much as the crime. The legislation placed a strong emphasis on state power and individual accountability. Builders might be executed if their shoddy homes collapsed and the occupants were killed. Vendors who defrauded clients risked being disfigured. With stringent regulations controlling marriage, inheritance, and parental power, even family conflicts were strictly regulated. Particularly severe penalties were meted out, frequently by execution or public humiliation, for adultery, theft, and false accusations. The code was groundbreaking because of both its content and its visibility. It was carved with the picture of Hammurabi receiving divine authority from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice, and it stood in public places. This paper was more than just a legal one. It was propaganda supporting the notion that Hammurabi's laws were sacrosanct and unchangeable, and that he reigned by divine right. The Code of Hammurabi created the idea that laws should be codified, standardized, and easily accessible, despite how harsh they may appear by today's standards. It substituted formalized norms for subjective judgment. By doing this, it established the foundation for later legal systems throughout antiquity and continues to captivate ethicists, historians, and lawyers. Justice wasn't blind in Babylon. It had a chisel and was observing. Justice was more than just a legal idea in ancient Egypt. The force was cosmic. Ma'at, a divine principle that embodies truth, balance, and moral order, was revered by the Egyptians. Ma'at was more than just a goddess. She was the very basis of the cosmos. In addition to their authority, pharaohs had a duty to protect Ma'at. By doing this, they preserved the balance between nature, civilization, and the gods. Egyptian justice was more case-specific and flexible than Babylon's written laws. There wasn't a single, unchanging legal code. Rather, judges, who were frequently clerics or prominent officials, interpreted Ma'at in their decisions. This made it possible to make conclusions based on context, but it also made justice potentially quite arbitrary and contingent on the social status of people involved. The court process was performative as well as formal. Depending on the seriousness of the case, it may be tried before higher tribunals within the royal bureaucracy or before local officials. Witnesses were crucial, and both plaintiffs and defendants gave their accounts of what happened. Papyrus, a comparatively sophisticated recording system for its period, was used to preserve written documents such as contracts, testimony, petitions, and records. Fines, beatings, or forced labor are possible penalties for simple offenses like stealing or assault. Serious offenses like blasphemy and tomb robbery were viewed as crimes against the gods as well as the state. These could result in posthumous punishment, such as mutilation of the corpse to bar passage into the afterlife, drowning or impalement, or even execution, sometimes by fire. The Book of the Dead, which depicts the deceased's heart being measured against the feather of Ma'at, is arguably the most famous representation of Egyptian justice. Amit, a crocodile-lion-hippopotamus monster, ate the heart if it was loaded with sin, and the soul was doomed to forgetfulness. The soul could enter the field of reeds, an endless paradise, if it balanced with the feather. In Egypt, spirituality and justice were inextricably linked. The courtroom was a hallowed place where divine order was maintained, not merely a place for disagreement. Egyptian justice, in contrast to Babylon's strict laws, followed the moral currents of Ma'at, rewarding those who lived in accordance with the truth and punishing those who upset the universe's equilibrium. In contrast to the divine or king-centered systems of Babylon and Egypt, justice in ancient Greece, especially at Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, took on a completely different form. The Greeks started experimenting with something revolutionary, a judicial system based on public involvement, citizenship, and debate. Although it was far from flawless, it served as the basis for many contemporary legal theories. Every male citizen of Athens had the right to take part in the legal system as a juror, a plaintiff, or a defendant. Neither judges nor attorneys were professionals. Rather, large juries, sometimes numbering in the hundreds, were chosen at random from the general populace. In addition to hearing cases, these jurors had to provide decisions on judgments and punishments without the ability to appeal. A water clock known as a clepsydra was used to measure the amount of time each party had to present their case during the brief trials, which were frequently finished in a single day. The cases varied greatly in type. Trials might be held for theft, defamation, adultery, assault, property conflicts, and even impiety, which is the disrespect for the gods. More serious crimes could result in death, especially where treason or religious sacrilege were involved, although minor offenses were typically punished with fines or banishment. For instance, Socrates was infamously given the death penalty for allegedly defaming the gods and corrupting the youth. Crucially, Greek legal systems did not depend on a publicly available written code of law. A limited literate elite held much of the legal information, even though certain laws were written publicly. As a result, decisions frequently relied more on rhetoric than precedent. A wealthy individual who could pay a talented orator to speak for them or a bright speaker had a distinct edge. Persuasion and performance were strongly linked to justice. In addition, the Athenians employed ostracism, a preemptive justice system in which residents might vote once a year to banish someone from the city for 10 years. There was only an agreement that someone had grown too strong or dangerous for the state's well-being. No crime had to be proven. The notion that justice may be a shared public duty rather than merely the will of a monarch or priest was first presented by ancient Greece, notwithstanding its flaws. It was an early, tumultuous legal equality experiment that continues to reverberate in courtrooms today. Dharma, a difficult-to-translate term that generally translates to duty, righteousness, and cosmic law, was the foundation of justice in ancient India. Indian justice was about preserving harmony in the cosmos, society, and the self, not merely about right and wrong, unlike the civic trials of Greece or the law codes of Babylon. Justice was a very contextual and ethical matter because dharma differed according to one's age, caste, gender, and stage of life. Ancient India's legal system was initially codified in Dharma Shastras, the most famous of which is the Manusmriti, or Laws of Manu, which was assembled between the 2nd and 3rd centuries BCE. These texts influenced legal thought for centuries, but they weren't laws in the contemporary sense. Rather, they were social and spiritual precepts. They provided definitions for marriage, contracts, penalties, inheritance, and property rights. A key component of this legal philosophy was the caste system. Different laws and punishments applied to Brahmins, priests, Kshatriyas, warriors, Vaishyas, merchants, and Shudras, laborers. For example, a Shudra who commits the same conduct may be punished with corporal punishment or worse, but a Brahmin who commits the same offense may be fined or temporarily barred from rights. In this system, justice was hierarchical, closely linked to a person's birth and not blind. Indian justice, however, was not totally unforgiving. Repentance was important, as was the idea of intent. Judges were urged to take the accused's moral and spiritual condition into account, and a wrongdoer could reduce sentence by charity or penance. Frequently acting as the highest court, kings combined divine law with royal edict and were counseled by Brahmin experts. Ordeals could occur during trials, particularly if the evidence was equivocal. These included walking through fire, holding a red-hot iron, and removing things from boiling oil, all of which were thought to demonstrate guilt or innocence in accordance with divine will. These techniques were viewed as a last option rather than commonplace. In ancient India, justice was primarily concerned with maintaining cosmic balance. Correcting societal disorder, bringing souls back toward Dharma, and redressing spiritual wrongs were all more important than merely punishing crime. Morality, religion, and the law were all intertwined in this system of justice. In the past, communities frequently looked to the gods for guidance. When their judicial systems failed, there was insufficient proof, witnesses were untrustworthy, or accusations could not be proven. Trial by ordeal, which was employed in many cultures including Babylon, India, and later medieval Europe, was one of the most spectacular and horrifying ways this occurred. The concept was straightforward yet cruel. Divine justice would step in through suffering if human justice was unable to decide guilt. Throwing the accused into a river was a frequent torture in Babylon. The gods had spared them and they were deemed innocent if they survived or floated. Although it was inconvenient that the deceased could no longer be punished, guilt was established if they drowned. Since water was seen as a holy and unbiased power, this approach demonstrated a strong belief in divine oversight. According to the Dharma Shastras, there were several types of ordeal in ancient India. These included surviving venom exposure, recovering coins from boiling oil, and walking across hot iron plowshares. The reasoning was divine arbitration, not cruelty. It was considered evidence of innocence to survive unhurt, or with only minor injuries. It was thought that the gods would not permit needless suffering for the defenseless. Trial by ordeal was not necessarily strictly physical, but it was horrifying by today's standards. It sometimes involved taking oaths in places of worship. It was believed that swearing on a sacred object or calling forth the wrath of a deity bound the speaker to truth. It was thought that lying in such circumstances would result in immediate or future divine retribution. The trauma has enormous psychological power. It could strengthen believers' trust in cosmic justice and scare them into confession. However, it also demonstrated the vulnerability of human legal systems and the profound desire for something outside of human judgment that ancient peoples felt. Typically, ordeals were used as a last resort to settle disputes that no one else could. Ordeals demonstrated a yearning for justice, even though they relied on supernatural results. Indeed, they were vicious, but in a peculiar way they were also democratic. They might be applied to both peasants and kings. The gods were supposed to act as judge, jury, and executioner in the lack of forensics or due process, turning agony into a courtroom. There were no elected juries or unbiased courts in ancient Egypt to deliver justice. It came straight from the pharaoh's almighty power. The pharaoh was seen as the earthly manifestation of Ma'at, the concept of truth, equilibrium, and cosmic order, in his dual roles as monarch and living deity. This implied that upholding justice was a holy duty rather than merely a political one. The supreme legal authority belonged to the pharaoh. His word had the power to overturn any court ruling, order the execution of offenders, forgive the guilty, and change laws whenever he pleased. God's approval, not human reasoning, was used to justify this consolidation of power. The universe's harmony would be upset if the pharaoh was disobeyed. However, the pharaoh was not the only ruler. From local magistrates in provincial towns to royal officials in the metropolis, Egypt was home to a large bureaucratic apparatus. These officials served as detectives, scribes, and judges. Rather than following a codified legal code, they made choices based on Ma'at principles and royal edicts. Rare and mostly case-based, written laws were transmitted through scribal training and precedent. The importance and size of courtrooms varied. In nearby communities, a council of elders or temple priests may decide conflicts. Complex cases involving property, theft, violence, and inheritance were heard in official judgment halls located in large cities. We have a unique view into how the ancient Egyptians debated and made decisions because the proceedings were meticulously documented on papyrus scrolls, many of which have survived to this day. Written evidence and testimony were both used in the trials. Both plaintiffs and defendants testified, frequently under oath. Physical evidence was taken into consideration where it was available, and witnesses were called. False charges were taken seriously and, if validated, might lead to the accuser being punished the way the criminal was supposed to be punished. The severity of the penalties ranged from fines and reparations to forced labor, whipping, or execution. Crimes committed against royal property, temples, or tombs were given extra punishment. However, the system also placed a strong emphasis on compensation and rehabilitation. Errors were frequently given the chance to atone, especially if they willingly confessed. Egyptian justice was distinct because it combined moral expectation with absolute rule. Although the pharaoh had unbridled authority, he was supposed to exercise it equitably. A just ruler was not just feared in the eyes of his people and his gods. He was regarded as the protector of cosmic harmony. In contrast to many ancient civilizations where justice was governed by divine kings and priestly castes, ancient Greece, especially democratic Athens, took a very different tack. Gods and kings were no longer the only ones who could administer justice. Through councils and popular assemblies, citizens shared and implemented it as a civic obligation. The ecclesia, the citizen assembly, and the Heliaia, a vast popular court made up of jurors, were the two main organizations in charge of administering justice in Athens. Law and justice were shaped by common masculine people who alternately participated in governance rather than being passed down from monarchs. To avoid bribery or manipulation, trials were held before enormous juries, often 500 or more, and laws were submitted and decided by the assembly. Judges in the contemporary sense did not exist. Rather, magistrates who were chosen by popular vote or lottery conducted trials and made sure that the rules were observed. But the jury, which was selected at random from among people over 30, rendered the decision. Penalties were voted on immediately after guilt was established, and decisions were definitive because there was no deliberation room or appeals process. Persuasive speech was valued more highly than evidence in this system. Plaintiffs and defendants were forced to either engage qualified orators to write speeches for them or represent themselves. The outcome might be changed by deftly manipulating public sentiment, and rhetoric was crucial. This system encouraged civic engagement but also allowed for uneven justice, which was more about persuasion than the law. Special assemblies or councils were called to discuss specific political issues or threats to the state. One well-known method was ostracism, in which voters exiled anyone they believed to be a threat to democracy once a year. Just a general agreement that someone's influence was unhealthy was sufficient. No crime had to be committed, no trial, no defense, 10 years in exile. The Greek council-based system brought significant new concepts despite its flaws. The value of free discussion, peer review, and the idea that the people own the law. It was revolutionary, but it was also messy, passionate, and occasionally unfair. Greek justice viewed the courtroom as a stage, the citizen as the judge, and justice as a public performance in which all men participated and the people themselves briefly held the reins of power. Justice in ancient India went well beyond courts and penalties. It was entwined with the idea of karma, which holds that every deed has moral significance and spiritual repercussions, both in this life and the next. Indian justice placed a strong emphasis on a cosmic ledger, where no wrongdoing escaped ultimate accountability, in contrast to the municipal trials of Greece or the royal decrees of Egypt. Karma was a moral law ingrained in Buddhist, Jain, and Hindu traditions rather than a legal system. While poor activities caused misery, even if not immediately, good actions produced favorable results. The universe itself would balance the scales even if a thief managed to elude human justice. Even in the absence of enforcement, ethical behavior was encouraged by this notion. Nevertheless, there were organized legal systems in ancient India. In addition to providing instruction for courts, the Manusmriti and other Dharmasastras also provided guidance for personal behavior. They emphasized that justice was not a one-size-fits-all concept by outlining particular responsibilities for every caste and social position. It was expected of kings to govern in accordance with Dharma, otherwise there may be political and spiritual repercussions. The karmic conception of justice was further developed by Buddhism, which first appeared in the 5th century BCE. It advocated for universal moral values, non-violence, honesty, and compassion, while rejecting caste-based legal discrimination. Emperor Ashoka, who gave up conquest and restructured his empire around Buddhist principles in the 3rd century BCE, was influenced by Buddhist ethics, even though they were not a legal code. His well-known rock edicts discussed tolerance, mercy, and the moral obligation of government. Therefore, justice encompassed much more than only trial and punishment. It was about spiritual accountability, intention, and inner purity. A person may avoid the punishment of a monarch, yet they will still be held accountable for their actions. Similarly, an unjust king was thought to be accumulating pain for himself in later incarnations. A strong, internalized system of order was produced by this karmic conception of justice. For many, it was far more scary than any earthly power, and it was very personal. Indian civilization saw justice as a force for re-establishing equilibrium between the individual, community, and the cosmos, whether it was upheld by the law or left to the universe. The emergence of Babylon, Egypt, Greece, and India occurred thousands of years ago, but their legal systems still influence our modern conceptions of crime, punishment, and justice. The conceptual, ethical, and procedural underpinnings of legal systems that continue to govern society today were established by these ancient civilizations. The earliest known codified law was brought to us by Babylon, which also established the notion that the state should uphold justice and make it apparent to the people. In legal and ethical discussions, the eye for an eye principle is still used to illustrate the need for just punishment as well as the perils of excessive retaliation. The ideas of divine kingship and moral law, where justice was not just social but cosmic, were brought to Egypt. The focus on harmony, honesty, and balance is echoed in contemporary concepts of restorative justice, which aim to restore community equilibrium rather than merely punish. By linking citizenship and participation to justice, Greece transformed the concept. Public debate, jury trials, and the idea of peer judgment all originated in Athens and are now essential components of many modern legal systems. Greek democracy sowed the roots for legal systems that prioritize public participation and responsibility, despite their flaws and exclusions. India made significant ethical and spiritual contributions to the field of justice. By promoting individual accountability and self-control, the ideas of dharma and karma gave legal systems a moral foundation. The continuing influence of historical traditions is demonstrated by the hybrid system that still exists in Indian law today, where religious and customary laws coexist alongside British legal systems. These were not perfect systems. They were frequently cruel, patriarchal, classist, and unfair. They upheld hierarchies, penalized the weak, and favored the wealthy. However, they also raised important issues that are still pertinent today. Who has the authority to define justice? Is it based on morality, societal agreement, or heavenly authority? Should the law be applied uniformly or according to a person's social role? How can we strike a balance between mercy and punishment? The DNA of these early institutions is still present in modern law despite its greater structure and humaneness. We continue to figuratively etch laws into stone in the hopes that they will maintain order. Justice is still a topic of discussion in legislatures, courts, and intellectual institutions, and we continue to struggle with the same timeless conflict between justice and power, morality and the law, and crime and its repercussions. Our quest for justice is, in many respects, both ancient and continuous.